Alright, so the focus in this video is going to be nested loops. So you know how I mentioned that these loops that we're talking about, you can use them with any other piece of code that we've already been talking about, right? We had an example before that showed a loop with a function definition. That's totally fine to do. So check this out. You can have a loop inside of another loop. So if you have a loop inside of another loop, we call that a nested loop. It's sort of a meta loop, right? I heard you like loops, so I put a loop in your loops. Alright, so let's talk about what these look like and how they work. And I'll preface this by saying they might seem a little bit complicated, but just stick with me. I promise to break it down in a way that is at least somewhat understandable. So let's go ahead and start talking about nested loops. Alright, so here's an example of a nested loop. So again, the idea of a nested loop is that it is a loop inside of another loop. So let's go ahead, let's just start with our diagram, because that's what's going to help us out the most here, I think. So let's go ahead and draw our variables out in their little boxes. So these are poor variable names. You should not use variable names like this in your own personal code, but for sake of example, this is what we're going to do right now. So we have two variables here, right? We have x and y. These are the two variables that are in our loops. Let's first talk about x. So the range statement that x is with is range 5, 8. So that means we're going to start at 5, then go to 6, then go to 7, then stop, right? Don't include the 8. Alright, let's talk about the y. So the y just has one argument, which means we start at 0, and then we go up to that argument but not include it, so we get 0, 1, 2. And we have our little arrows here, noting where we're going to start. Now let's talk about how this works. So I'm Python, I'm reading the code, I hit this first for loop. Cool. So I hit this first for loop for x in range 5, 8. So I'm going to start here. X is now 5. Cool. Alright, so again, the rule is with for loops, remember, we cannot go to the next number for x until we finish everything inside of this loop, right? So we have to do all of this and complete it before we get to the 6. So let's talk about this loop now. For y in range 3, let's go back over here. That means we're going to start with y having 0. Alright, now in this loop, we have to go through everything here before we go back to the top here. So let's now do this line of code. We're going to print x and y separated by a tab character. This point in time, x is 5. That's this 5 right here. And y is 0. So we have 5, tab, 0. Alright, now here's maybe the weird part. So we just finished this iteration of this loop. Now we go back up to this loop again. So we have to do this entire loop before we go back up to this loop. Alright, so we're on this loop. We've done an iteration, so we go back over here. We move this arrow over. So now y is 1. And we do this print statement again. X is still 5. Y is now 1. So we have 5 and 1. Let's keep going. We're still just on this loop. So now we go to the next value for y. So we go over here. Move this arrow over. Y is now 2. Awesome. Now we do the statements inside of this for loop here. We print x, still 5. We print y, now 2. So 5 and 2. Alright, now here's the interesting part. So at this point in time, we go back up here and we see, hey, we're done here. We've done all the values for y. So that means we have finally finished one iteration of this entire loop. So now we go back to the top here for x in range 5, 8, and we finally move this arrow over. So again, the rule is here, we can't move the arrow over for x until we finish everything here first. Because again, the rule is everything underneath this for loop needs to finish before we go back up to the top and move our arrow over. Now what that does mean is we've moved this arrow over to 6 now for x, and now we're hitting this for loop again, and we have to reset. So it's as if we're seeing this for loop for the first time. So we have to reset, move this arrow back to 0. So y is now 0. And we do this print statement, x, print x, well x is now 6, y is 0, so we have 6 and 0. Alright, so again we have to finish this entire loop again before we go back up to this one. So looking at y, move this arrow over, now we're at 1, y is 1, we do this print statement, x is still 6, y is 1, so we have 6 and 1. Got to keep finishing this loop. So we go back up to the top of this loop, move this arrow over. So now, now we move the arrow to the 2. Y is now 2. Go ahead and do this print. X, still 6, y, 2, so we have 6 and 2. Now at this point, you can see we are finally done with this loop again, right? Because we're out of values for y. So we finished another loop, another full loop of this one, which means, hey, now we can go back up to this one and go to the next value here. So now we can finally move this arrow over to the 7. X now gets the value 7. Cool. We fall down, we hit this loop again. And again, we treat it as if we are seeing it for the first time. So that means we have to reset back to 0. So y is now 0. We do this print, x, 7, y, 0, 7 and 0. We got to finish this entire inner loop here. So we move this arrow over. Now that's a 1. So we get 7 and 1. Move this arrow over again. Now y is 2. So we get 7 and 2. And then we finish this loop again, which means we go back up to the top of this one. And hey, look, we're done. There's no more numbers. We hit the end. There is nowhere else I can move this arrow for x. I know that was a long example. There is a reason why we make computers do things for us, so we don't have to do this all by hand all the time. But it is still very important that you understand how it works so that when you code it, you know what's going on. So let's digest a little bit what we just talked about with this example. So nested loops. So in the previous example, you saw that there was like an outer loop. This first one here is what I would call the outer loop, the 4x in range 5, 8. And then the inner loop, the one inside, is the 4y in range 3. So the inner loop has to go through every single iteration for every single iteration of the outer loop, right? And we saw that. So for every value that we had for the outer loop, we had to do a complete loop for the inner loop. Another thing to sort of point out is that inner loops will complete their loops faster than the outer loops, right? And we saw that the inner loop went 3 times, but it finished it quickly, and the outer loop took a very long time to finish, right? Because the outer loop was, every single time the outer loop iterated forward one more step, the inner loop had to do all of its loops. And then we went back to the outer loop, moved one more step, inner loop, all of its loops, and so on. So something that's just kind of interesting, to get the total number of iterations of a nested loop, so that means the total number of loops that we have going on, you can multiply the number of iterations of all the loops. And we kind of see that in this example, right? We have two loops here. We have the two nested loops, and every time we had to iterate for x, you can see 5, 5, 5. Those are all the iterations of the inner loop for the first iteration of the outer loop. 6, 6, 6. Those are all the iterations for the inner loop for the second iteration of the outer loop. 7, 7, 7. Those are all the iterations for the inner loop for the last iteration of the outer loop. So I know it seems like a lot, but just sort of keep these rules in mind, right? The inner loop has to finish completely before you can move forward with the outer loop. And use those arrows and those variable box drawing diagrams to help you keep track, because it's really easy to lose track of where you're at, especially with the outer loop, since you're dealing with the inner loop so much more. So make use of those drawings and use those arrows to keep track of where you're at. Alright, here's another example. So this one's on you. Go ahead and pause the video. Work through this one. I have faith in you. You can do it. And then come back when you are ready to see the results. Alright, so let's step through this. So the first number you should get is 5. Next one's 6, 4, and 5 again. Let's go ahead. I won't step through everything, but let me step through maybe a couple of iterations, and then you can sort of fill in the rest. So let me go ahead and make a new file here. Alright, cool. So same idea. We have two variables here. We have num, and we have val. Let's talk about the sequence that num is going to get. We have 5, 3, negative 1, so we start at 5. Next number is 4, and that's it, right? Do not include the 3. Alright, val in range 2, so we start at 0, 1, and don't include the 2. Alright, so I'm Python. I'm reading the code. I hit this for loop. So now num is going to get this value 5. Cool. That means all of this has to complete before we move this arrow over to the 4. Alright, so now we hit this for loop. Now val is going to get the value 0. Cool. We print num plus val. So right now num is 5, val is 0, so that's where this first 5 is coming from. Cool. Alright, now we've done this. We go back to the top of the inner loop. Remember, we have to do the full inner loop first. So we can go ahead, move this arrow over. Val is now 1. And we do all the statements in the inner loop again. Print num plus val, num 5, val 1. We get 6. Cool. Now at this point, we go back to the top here. We see we've finished this loop, right? We've hit all the values in the sequence. So that means we finally finished one full iteration of this loop, which means we can now go back to num, move this arrow over to 4, and do it all again. So now we're at 4 for num. We hit this loop as if it's the first time we're seeing it. So we have to reset this back to 0. Print num plus val, we get 4. And then the 5 is going to come from the fact that in the next iteration of this inner loop, we'll move this over to the 1. 4 plus 1 will be that 5. Alright. One more example. Alright, so same sort of idea, nested loops. Just make sure you finish the full iteration of the inner loop before you move over to the next iteration for the outer loop. Go ahead and pause this video, come back when you are ready to see the results. Alright. went too far there. So hopefully you got this. If you do have any questions about this example, please do let me know. For sake of time, I'm not going to walk through this again, but if you did run into any questions, make sure you are doing those variable box drawing diagrams, and make sure for every iteration of the outer loop, in this case the outer loop is for item 1 in range 1, 10, 3, for every single time you move the value for item 1 over, you have to fully complete that inner loop. The inner loop here is for item 2 in range 5, 9. And the other thing that I will point out too is that this print statement for print value, this happens after you run through the iterations for the inner loop. Alright, so it's part of the outer loop, but it's after the inner loop, so you have to pay attention to those indents. If you do have questions about this though, please let me know. I'll be happy to clarify. That said, there is more practice to be done with nested loops, because I know they're a little bit tricky. Hopefully they're not too bad though. It's just, you know, it's a lot of things to sort of keep track of at once, so keep using those diagrams, and I think that'll help. So go ahead and make sure you spend a little bit of time at least working through those practice pages posted on Canvas. And I mean, there's going to be other practice pages as well, but I wanted to highlight these. So there's one called Practice with Nested For Loops. So this is one where it's basically like these examples that I've shown you, and you know, you work through it and tell us what the results are. And then there's another one that's Practice Writing Your Own Nested For Loops. So this one's a little bit more interesting and will probably take a lot more time. So on this Practice Writing Your Own, this will be in the format of I give you a problem and you need a nested loop to solve it. So that will take a little bit more time. It's pretty cool once you see it working. But if you have any questions about the practice pages, please do let me know.